MG Rod back with you, and today we're back on the Big Heeley. And what we're going to be working on today? Carburetors. Let's get going. So this being a late Heeley 3000, the BJ8, it used twin HD8 carburetors. And for those of you who are used to MGs, the thing that'll look weird to you is they put the float bowls to the inside to where they're right beside each other. But these the SU carburetors, they have a couple different series. You have the H series, HS, HIF, and then the HDs. H series, most of you may already know this, but basically stands for horizontal because the carburetors sit horizontally. The HS stands for side float bowl. The HIF is integrated float bowl or integral float bowl. Where the HD, I believe the correct nomenclature is direct mounted. But I'm not 100% sure about that. It's a little hard to verify. But the float bowl mounts directly to the bottom of the carburetor, so there's no cork gland seals like there is on the H series carburetor, and no tube going across like on the S series or HS series carburetor. This is the front carburetor, and I haven't cleaned it up yet. This is the rear carburetor. I've already taken it off, kind of took it apart, and did a quick cleanup in my solvent tank. Now I will do some more cleaning on it as I'm going to reassemble it. But you got the float bowl here, and you got this assembly that goes on here, which there's a jet here that goes in here that slides up inside of here. Now the original jet was here. It was actually stuck in there. Now the front carburetor, I could get it to move by moving the lever. The rear one wouldn't. So I had to carefully drive that out of there because it gets corrosion built up on there. Because remember, this thing sat for 10 or 15 years. And these have this diaphragm. That's actually what seals, keeps it from leaking all over the place. That acts as the seal around here. But the seal on this one was about as supple as a potato chip, or crisp on the other side of the pond, if you will. But it uses this lever to pull the jet down to richen it up, and then the spring underneath the jet to push it back up, which sits in here. And then it uses the brass float, which nowadays you can also get the nitro fills, which don't sink if you prefer. So I ended up getting new jets, some new gasket sets, and some new needles and seats with the nitrile tips. Or is it not nitrile, but whatever, the rubber tip seats. They're much less prone to actually sticking on with 10% ethanol fuel like we have here in America, because they get sticky. It leaves residues behind and gets sticky, and these are a little less likely to stick closed than the standard metal tipped ones. All right, so now I've gone through this, and some of the pieces that I'm starting with I've already gone through and give it a little bit of a cleanup with what I like to call my universal solvent, which is not carb cleaner. I actually don't like carb cleaner, at least not the stuff that's available here in the US. Now these little detail brushes can be really nice for cleaning up, especially these flanges around here where the seals and gaskets are. But one thing we need to do is with this assembly in place, with the jet sitting in place here, we got to make sure that the jet is centered. So with all this together, you make sure this comes down with a nice little thud like that. If it doesn't, then you got to take this apart And you loosen that up and move that around until we get a good thud. Now, that makes sure it's centered. The other thing you can do is there are tools, like this one here, which essentially does the same thing by pushing through here and, whoops, without that, sorry. Push that through there with this screwed in place, and then you can tighten that, and that's supposed to center it up. Now, of course, it's also possible that these aren't machine perfect, or if you've dropped them, this could be bent, something like that, and they won't be perfect. Mine, I've used mine, and it's just ever so slightly off, but close enough that you can work with it. So this particular car doesn't have a ton of miles on it. It's only 40-something thousand. So I don't expect there to be a lot of wear on these, but what you want to check is always check for wear here. Move these back and forth and see how much wear there is. Now, you can ream them out, put oversized throttle shafts in there, or you can actually rebush them too if they're worn out. And if they're worn out and there's a lot of movement, that will cause all kinds of issues with setting the idle. You'll never get a consistent idle because they'll move around on you and allow air in. These actually feel pretty good. There's a light bit of movement on this side, but that's no more movement than what you would get if you reamed them out with a reamer and put new shafts in, so I'm leaving this alone. Now, like I said, I've cleaned these up a little bit, but I haven't tried to like make these like perfect or anything. The guy just wants to drive it. It's no show queen, and I'm just making everything clean to be in keeping with where the rest of the engine compartment's at, or just slightly better. Maybe it'll look a little better than it did before, but like I said, we're not doing a concours job here. We're not trying to either. But I guess we'll start with this assembly here. I went ahead and put a little light grease right here just to help prevent some wear and make it work smoothly. This has to go up under here. It would be easier if this wasn't actually hooked up. And you could leave that up there, giving yourself plenty of movement here. But I've got it hooked up, so we're going to deal with it. So we just need to snug all these up. And like I said, this is the rear carburetor, so the float bowl actually goes on the front side of the carburetor. So then if we work this, the jet goes down, just like we want it to. And then we can put this on. There is the hole for the vacuum. So you're going to make sure that's over here. Of course, the shape of this kind of dictates that, but can't say I've worked with these HD carburetors a whole lot. I do a whole lot of HS and HIFs on MGBs though. I do several sets a year of those. And there's the basic part of the carburetor put together. Now we need to start looking at the top side of it. So a little bit more of the universal solvent to clean these up a little bit more. Now, the needle on this is pretty clean, not much wear on it, so I'm not worrying about changing it out on this one. But one thing you want to do is you want to actually slide, well, let's get a little bit of oil. You should lubricate this a little bit, and with whatever oil you're putting in the dash pot. In my case, I use 2050 engine oil. Now you can tailor the oil to your tune on your engine, where you live and all that. I know people, over the years, I've heard people talking about using sewing machine oil and automatic transmission fluid, engine oil of many different weights. 2050 works really good for the weather we get here. And now I know there are some people out there that say that because of wear within the essentially shock absorber, if you will, the damper rod, because of wear over the years, you should use 80W90 gear lube. But interesting side note there is 80W90 gear lube is a completely different rating system than, say, this 2050 engine oil, right? They're completely different rating systems. And if you actually look at the velocity chart of how they flow in different temperatures, 80, 90, and 2050 overlap most of the way, and there's very little actual difference in viscosity. But you want to make sure this actually spins and doesn't catch and slides nice and smooth through here. Now, another thing you should do is between the two carbs is actually, let them drop and check how long it takes for each of them to drop. And if one's dropping a lot faster than the other one, then you can play around with, then maybe these have been swapped at some point, or the piston and stuff has been swapped back and forth. You can swap them and play around with them, and you should have them both dropping at the same amount of time. Just put your finger over it and let it drop down with just the air from coming in here. And so they're both timed the same amount of time. And if you can't get them to do that, then you get them the best you can, and you can actually come in here with a little bit of like wet dry, like 1000, 1500 grit, and you can polish the inside of this just a little bit, or look for any kind of burrs here, clean those up, and get them, the one that goes down the slowest, get it to come down the same as the other one. And if you get a bunch of like scraping here, then you kind of need to polish those spots too. I actually find just spinning this will usually polish it up on its own, and then you clean it back out and it'll work fine. But if you can't get it to do, then you might have a warped chamber and then need replaced. So we want to put this in, lining that notch up to that. And don't forget the spring. If I had $1 for every time I tried to throw one of these together without that spring in place, I wouldn't be able to retire, but I'd have a whole lot more dollars than I have now. And then this thing only fits one way. And you put your screws in, and we double check that it all Now, I actually tend to like to put these on the car without the dash pots on them, because it makes it easier to get in and get all these bolts lined up. But for what we're doing here, for this demonstration, we'll go ahead and put it on now, because I also want to double check that both pistons drop the same amount. So I'll be taking this back apart and going through all this part again before I finish. But then you want to make sure that this drops, and like here, we're not quite getting it to drop, so it might be in the way this got tightened down. Or I might have to go back and actually recenter the jet. Yeah, we're not quite hitting now, see? That's the importance of having everything bolted together, which on these carburetors is a pain in the butt because you pretty much have to have it all the way together to know if it's going to hit. And then you got to take it back apart and recenter the jet and then put it all back together. But oh, wait, there we go. So you just see how sometimes they can be close enough where just how you tighten this down can make the difference. That means the jet's centered, but not as perfectly centered as it could possibly be. But as long as it drops like that, we're good to go. And now we can look at the needles and seats and setting the float height. So now we need to take this apart, and you'll see if you look closely enough, one side has a little bit of a notch in it, and the other side's smooth. I don't want to call it a notch, but you can just wouldn't really call it a notch, but it's got a little bit of a little flat spot in there, or punch, whatever you want to call it. It's there so that when you slide it in there, it bites into there and stays in place. So you want to slide it out that way. So here's the original style needles. So it's a metal tip there. And then we get the seat out. I'd like to just use these. I know they make a little tool for it, and I actually had that tool at one time, but they're sheet metal and they're kind of delicate, and mine cracked eventually. So these genuine ones are getting to be a little bit expensive anymore, or pricey. They have changed the design now from what they used to be. But part of the reason why they're getting more pricey, other than the fact that everything's getting pricey anymore, because of the supply chain and everything since the COVID, it comes with all the gaskets. So this fits the HIF, this fits the HS, this fits the H, and then this fits the HD. So the fact that they give you all those gaskets with them does drive the price up a little bit on them. Put that back in. And now the next thing we're going to have to do here is actually check the float height. And now I just need to double check now on this particular one which measurement is the correct measurement and grab the proper tool. Now if you have one of these SU toolkits, the wrench itself is actually 1/8 of an inch thick, so it can be used on a lot of the HS ones where the float setting is 1/8 inch on the lid. And then you've got these, which obviously you're supposed to put them in there to check the air height, but you'll notice one of them is oval while the other two are not. So this represents your 3/8 for carbs that are supposed to get 3/8. The flat way represents 5/16, and standing up represents 7/16. In this case, we're supposed to be 7/16, so then you put that in there and you check that to make sure that it's sitting at 7/16. So like here, since we're raising up, we're not where we want to be. So we actually would be bending, tweaking this just slightly until we get that sitting right where we want it. And I noticed oftentimes what I see is one arm is higher than the other, and that's really easy to just kind of push here to get them even. But you don't really want to be pushing on these to adjust it. You really want to be trying to adjust it, holding it down here and adjust it down at the bend here. So that's setting the float height on this. Now this, I'm going to go ahead and take this apart, clean all these up, and we got all new washers to go under these and everything yet too. I got this loose. When you take this thing out of here, you'll see that there is a screen and a spring in here. And you want to clean that screen out because that thing's there. You can see some crap in there. That thing's there to catch that stuff as it comes through the fuel system. So generally it's all cars that have these within the carburetors don't actually have any fuel filters installed on the car itself, because they're using this essentially as the fuel filter. I think it's still a good idea these days to go ahead and install one somewhere in the car in a discrete place where it's not too noticeable. You may not want to do it under the bonnet right by the carburetors, or if you don't care, you can. A lot of times what we'll do, like on TDs and MGAs, is back by the fuel tank itself, actually just cut the fuel line, the hard line there, and put one back there where it's can't be seen. So when you open the hood, or the bonnet, sorry, at car shows, it looks like it's supposed to look like underneath the hood, or bonnet, sorry, and you don't have a fuel filter hanging there. So I don't know if any of you noticed, but when I took this apart, this had two washers double stacked on the one side to try to get it to seal, because they had put this part with the groove against here. You don't want it that way. You want the head of the bolt there. And then we don't want to forget to put this back in. Then you can go ahead and double check, make sure everything's good here by just blowing through here and making sure that it shuts off. So now, all I gotta do is do everything I just did, the cleaning up and everything I just did to the other carburetor, and these will be ready to put on the car.